two cypherpunks.
I identify as a hacker.
Me too. I identify as a hacker.
I think of myself really as a tourist.
A foot soldier. In the cyberpunk.
That's right. I was hanging out on IRC at the right time.
Sorry, we can edit that out. Or not. Oh, we're talking like... No, wait till you drink. All right. Wait till you finish drinking. Take another sip. We got a day. Yeah, stop it!
The problem with being libertarian is that every 4 years, half of your team defects to the other side. Did you know I don't understand Zooko's triangle? I can't explain it. There's some, it's all wrong. It doesn't make sense. I hope you edit that part in. People have the right to secure communication and private communication one to another without anyone else's permission.
I'm actually really bullish on hackers, this distributed population of people who are opting in to the creation of tools of empowerment.
Both of you are hackers, entrepreneurs, and cypherpunks, and I'm so delighted to chat with you. Zooko, Wilcox, and Michael Tiffany. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here,
Naomi.
Yeah, so I wanted to dive into this. So like the cypherpunk era, it's kind of a world of mythos for a lot of people. We hear this name thrown around. We say, oh yes, you're cypherpunks. They change the world through code. The idea was to use technology as an instrument of change.
Cypherpunks write code, we said.
Let's just dive into that. Let's talk about how you both got involved in tech and privacy and wanting to change the world through code. So Zooko, you want to start?
How I got into tech and privacy is when I was a kid, I had a home computer and it came with a modem that you could plug an analog phone into and it would like screech at the phone in order to connect. Yeah. And I would connect to BBSs where you could chat with strangers
BBSs.
anonymously. Bulletin board systems. It was where you called over the local phone lines. Local phone calls were free, unlike long distance, right? So you could call a local number for free and connect your home computer to their computer. And then there was like a chat board and games and uploads and downloads and things like that. That's how I got started in cypherpunkery.
Cypherpunkery and the bulletin boards. Michael, what about you?
I too got sucked in via BBSs.
Oh, I see.
And BBSs were a gateway drug. I met other people who were sometimes local because of the preference for free calling. So then I fell in with like my local hacker gang. And then it was all just downhill from there. I feel like my formative period as a hacker was, and we identify via area codes, was in the 916, which is Northern California. And so you could find us on pound 916 on the FNet. Many of those hackers formed kind of the core nucleus of Ninja networks, ninjas.org, the ultimately transnational hacker gang that I fell into when I was a teenager.
How did you guys know each other? Because you guys are friends. Did every cypherpunk or hacker know each other back then?
I didn't know Michael back then.
Back then,
That's
interesting.
right.
I met Michael in, I think, 2015.
Oh,
Right.
interesting.
I was part of this early hacker scene, and also an entrepreneur. I've been trying to make cool stuff with technology and make cool companies making cool stuff with technology for my whole adult life. And I remember going to a party. Was it organized by? I think it was thrown by Sean Hastings, legendary cyberpunk Sean Hastings, who was the co-founding CEO of something called Havenco. Do you remember Havenco? Yeah. He
Well, tell me, what's Havenco?
Oh, Havenco was a magnificent offshore data haven on the micronation of Sealand.
Sealand.
You ever heard of
Oh,
Sealand?
I've heard of Sealand. I'll post some pictures so they know what I'm talking about.
So it was like a gun platform or something in the sea, and it had been occupied by some guy who declared himself the Prince of Sealand.
Prince Michael.
Prince Michael.
Yes.
I didn't know Prince Michael, so anything I say about him can be discounted as hearsay. Apparently, he had fired a gun at some invading ship at some point, thereby establishing his military sovereignty.
Oh, wow. That's all it takes, eh? So this place is outside of international. That's in international waters.
Well,
right?
technically, it was in international waters when he occupied it, but later they changed the rules from like 3 miles to 15 miles or something like that. So then it was arguably inside Great Britain's territory. So that's a point of contention.
That's right.
And then these crazy cypherpunks, Sean Hastings,
Ryan Lackey.
Samir Parek, Ryan Lackey, they formed a company to build a data haven and like a colo space, right? To run websites and servers and things like that.
This was during the bad old days when encryption was still considered a kind of munition.
Yeah.
So it was under export control by the United States government. So we were all worried about how security, privacy, and freedom could work on an internet where mathematical security was considered statutorily a kind of weapon.
Wow. And so the idea of hosting these servers on Sealand was that it was outside of any government's jurisdiction.
Yeah,
You could keep
except
that
for
data
the
safe.
government of Sealand, which had a
gun
deal,
firing.
a treaty or a deal or something with the company Havenco.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my personal web server was operated from Sealand for quite a while. If you went to zooko.com and loaded my homepage, and then I wrote a Perl script, or actually I think a Python script to serve up a copy of whatever MP3 I happened to be listening to at that moment in my dorm room in Boulder, Colorado. So you could listen along from Havenco, but the internet wasn't good enough back then, so it would skip a lot.
Right.
Sounds wonderful and useful.
Yeah.
It was the early Spotify.
The early Spotify, whatever Zooko was listening to in his dorm room. I like it. I tune into that. So, all right. So Sean Hastings, Sealand.
So I remember being at a party where Sean Hastings changed my life. It wasn't really a cyberpunk party. I would say it was more like a party full of internet entrepreneurs. And I had made some wry comment about how so many people at this party had business plans that they were pursuing where step one is something really anodyne, like help people share cat photos on the internet. and step 4 is world domination. And
whoever had the cat photo plan, they knew exactly how to get there.
and
Brilliant.
I was just wryly joking, and I remember Sean saying suddenly, it seemed very seriously, I'm not trying to take over the world. I'm trying to make it harder for anyone to. And this just stopped me cold. And I thought, that's a better life plan.
Lovely. What a great story.
So I've been developing a kind of theory of the hacker and cyberpunk social scene since that pivotal moment in my life, where I think of us, this kind of loose community, as broadly pursuing the cause of human freedom. And I've really been a security-oriented hacker. I've been working on defensive technology. So I've been thinking of the fight that I've been fighting as one where I'm making it harder for predators to successfully be predators. So, I'm working against bullies. I'm working against would-be authoritarians, those that just want to exert their will and control over others, sometimes to steal from them, sometimes to rule over them. And one way to make everyone freer is to knock down the power of those would-be predators. Whereas I was a fan of Zooko's work from afar long before we met.
Oh, thanks.
And I was thinking of things like the least authority file system, or categorically also, let's say, Tor, and now cryptocurrencies, as also fighting for human freedom, but from the other end. The insight being that if you make the people more powerful, if you give them literally more powerful tools, they become literally unruly, as in difficult to rule. Yes. So we've been working on the same cause and pushing on the lever on different ends in different directions.
You mentioned some of Zooko's early work. Let's dive into that first. Some of the things you were working on in the early days to make people more powerful.
The earliest thing that I can remember doing to make people more powerful was I had gone away to college and I was exchanging email with my mom. And I wanted to use PGP, which I had discovered pretty good privacy, the encryption program written by Phil Zimmerman and uploaded for free to the internet, for which Phil had been investigated by the federal government on suspicion of having exported weapons illegally, which was the first, that was when I got radicalized. And many people, that was the cause celeb of the very early cypherpunks. PGP is an encryption program. This was my first exposure. So BBSs were the fun, openness, the discovery of a new space, a new frontier to explore, and new people to meet, and I love BBSs. And then I was looking in the upload-download section of a BBS, and there was a file called PGP, which is short for pretty good privacy.
Wait, did you just see a file in there? And you're like, I'll download this random file.
There weren't very many
That's
files.
kind of like how it works, yeah.
Look, it's a new file.
You
Let's
guys
see
are
what it
security
is.
experts, right? Oh, wow. Times have changed.
So I downloaded the random file, and it turned out to be an encryption program, and it came with a text file. I think it was called like pgp1.doc or something like that, and then there was pgp2.doc. I don't know why he broke it up into two. Maybe it was too big for one file on DOS. I don't know. And it was a political manifesto. It said, it was this text file in like 80 columns on my PC, and it said, people have the right to secure communication and private communication one to another without anyone else's permission. And this program is an attempt to give them that capability in the new world of computers. And this is right and good, and government shouldn't stop it, or something like that. I forget what it said, but that was the first political manifesto of cypherpunkery, which motivated me. So then I went off to college, and I was using email to communicate back home to my mom, like, hi mom, how are things going? And I wanted to use PGP to protect my communications with my mom. But it was a lot of work for her to invoke PGP, like you cut and paste or save the email into a file, then you have to switch to the terminal and invoke PGP on the right file name and put it into an output. So I wrote a script that she could install, which would automatically invoke PGP and show her the resulting decrypted text. That was my first hack.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool. I would type up the letter. So it was integrated into these ancient Unix email programs, because she and I were logging on to some computer and sending email to each other. And there were these text-based email programs like Elm and Pine, they were called. So I would type up my letter and hit send, and then it would invoke my script, which would encrypt it to her. In fact, it would parse the two-line and encrypt it to the right email address depending on who I was sending to. And then when she would receive the email and she would click on that or hit enter on that email to see it, it would decrypt it and show her my letter.
Your mum was really advanced. How, like...
Yeah, she's pretty smart.
Like, wow. I can't imagine most people being able to dive into PGP even today who are tech savvy. It's difficult.
Oh yeah, nobody uses PGP because it's too hard to use.
Yeah, but your mum did. Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So,
She really wanted to know what was going on with me at college.
so it's like the only iteration of private email that's ever existed, were the emails between you and your mum, and since then, all in the clear. And so you were building systems that, like, when you talk about bringing powerful people down, that just makes me very curious. Like, who are you hacking, Michael?
Oh, wow.
What were you doing?
Well, I just, listening to Zooko's story was, in particular, the invocation of like Pine and Elm, made me want to raise my hand. I was a Mutt user.
Oh yeah.
And
good stuff.
And right, so then that had me thinking
jargon.
back, like how In some ways, these preferences for different, I guess we'd now call tool chains maybe, were like personality types in the early social scene of the internet, right? Where some people would say, I'm ENTP, like I'm a MUT user, right? The classic contrast is VI versus Emacs. All right-thinking VI users also liked MUT for email. I just want to point that out.
I usually manage to alienate and offend both sides in the debate. And in particular, I would always go ahead and jump in and say, oh yeah, I use Emacs, but I turn on the VI emulation mode that you can load into Emacs. It really works great when you have both at once. And everybody would scoot away.
If you had known each other back then, would you have been enemies like based on that?
No.
Why would you destroy your system?
No, we're naturally members of the same tribe.
Yeah, exactly.
I recently said that about Satoshi Nakamoto. I don't know, I didn't know him personally, and I don't have any kind of
Maybe
private...
you did.
Yeah, but talking about him for who he is. You know how you should respect people's choice of pronouns, right? Satoshi preferred to be called he. You should also respect people's choice of identity. Satoshi preferred to be Satoshi.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, I don't have any privileged information or anything, but it was just obvious from like personality and focus and actions that Satoshi was part of our tribe.
Right.
Like the same values and the same way of operating. So if Michael and I had met during those days, we would have been friends.
Yeah, perfectly put.
But you were a MUT user, and then how were you bringing down the system?
Well, I didn't think of it like this at the time, but my collaborator and a co-founder with me of White Ops, my friend Dan, we kind of observed together that our hacker superpower was really just having a highly trained intuition for the difference between how a computer is actually functioning and how its programmers think it's functioning.
Therein lies the opening.
That's right. And the fact is that software engineers, just like any engineer, is dealing with high-level abstractions in order to get their work done. And those abstractions work pretty well, but they're just a model of reality. They're not actually reality. What really turned me into a hacker, I think, is that the first computer that I had access to was a DOS machine. It was running an Intel 8088 processor. And like every machine that shipped with PC-DOS 3.1, it had a BASIC interpreter. So I learned BASIC. Then I felt like I ran into the limits of BASIC, and I wanted to do more. And I didn't have access to a compiler of any other programming language. So the only move available to me was to run debug.axe with the -A flag to go into assembly mode, and then I could write an x86 assembly. So and this is not even a super unique story, went from BASIC to x86 assembly, which is a little nuts, but there were many of us. And it's hard to it's hard to craft what we all call an app in assembly. So what I was really doing as I was trying to teach myself assembly was tinkering. I was playing mostly with other people's apps and shifting things around. And I now believe that that's a great way to train your intuition. So since I had no access to high-level abstractions, I was curious about something called Turbo Pascal, but I had no idea how to possibly get an IDE for it. So instead, there I was just tinkering with this much lower level language, and now I'd say that was really training my intuition for how the linker actually does its thing when you compile code, for instance. Not what your computer science professor told you a linker does, but what it actually does. And I guess that gave me eyes for the space between how a system is expected to behave, how it actually behaves, and the creativity possible in that space. So I was just a curious kid exploring that space. It was only later that turned into, let's say, real security work. I didn't land there intentionally. I was really just a curious kid following my curiosity. And it turns out that had important implications for the security of the globe, but it certainly wasn't on my radar when I was just, oh man, I remember the first thing I got to work. It was finding a single register on my DTK URSO BIOS that flipped my computer from running in 4.77 megahertz to a whopping 8 megahertz. Whoa.
I did a little bit of assembly, but I had access to higher level programming languages, so I ended up spending more time constructing things in the abstract zone instead of finding how to reuse or subvert things in the gap. So I was just a curious kid, and I wrote a bunch of programs for my own fun. I remember I was really proud when I was in middle school. I wrote a program because I had read an article probably in Scientific American or something like that about artificial life that could evolve. So I wrote a program in which there were these little points of light that had behaviors about which direction they would crawl and how fast and stuff like that. And if they ate enough food, then they would mitose. Is it meiosis or mitosis? Anyway, there become two of them. And the two of them would be some variant of their common ancestor, right? You would give birth to two like variants. And then there was patterns of food growing on the screen, so different kinds of behavior would get you better access to food. So then they would evolve over time as I sat and watched the behavior of the little colony of bugs, because the ones that didn't get enough food would die out, and the ones that did would replicate or reproduce. I was really proud of that. And
it's like an early version of Sim, like.
Right.
So this is a total tangent, but about that time in that era of my life, I had been raised in a fundamentalist Christian church, and I believed in creationism instead of evolution. I thought evolution was a deceit of Satan to lead men astray. But my little bugs did successfully change their behavior when they found enough food pellets, so that was part of my own learning process.
Interesting.
Ooh.
I still want to know how you subverted the system, Michael. How did you?
Being a hacker was like my social scene when I was a teenager. I hung out with the ninjas.
What's a ninja?
Oh, that's the name of my hacker tribe. We're probably most famous just for throwing a really great invite-only party called the Ninja Party at certain DEF CONs.
DEF CON's a hacker convention.
Yes, thank you. But I wasn't thinking that I would work in computer security. The first company that I started was an ISP. But following 9/11, I saw of course, new social interest in achieving security and safety for all by adding a host of new restrictions and controls everywhere. And that's not the only model for achieving security and safety. And I thought, maybe there are a lot of people who can be networking technology executives, but that intuition that I had been training in security might actually be rare and needed. So so that really drove me to a pivot towards trying to achieve security in freedom-loving ways. And so when you're thinking along those lines, then I think there's just a logical progression that one way to make people more secure is to make them less attractive victims in the first place. So ultimately, I think I was on a kind of journey that landed at the pursuit of the scalable models of cybercrime. There's of course there's an infinite variety of cybercrimes, and there's an infinite variety of motivations, but the crimes of scale, like if the people who are being victimized in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, that kind of mass exploitation is being done for the money. So if you can make a relatively small number of super scalable cybercrimes simply less profitable, then we could potentially have a far-reaching effect on the whole criminal underground, because it's the money made from those scalable cybercrimes that feeds the black market development of new exploit kits, new rootkits, etc. So starting with these little threads that I was pulling on, and just some view of the world swinging, it seemed to me, between just different views of authoritarianism. I thought it'd be nice to try my hand at demonstrating that other models are possible. And after much iteration, it turns out that we did find some really solid models for having this realized positive effect on the world, where we're literally decreasing the amount of successful frauds in certain domains. But that's a story that I can now tell by looking back over the decades and drawing out some themes, but a lot like the simple autonomous agents that Zooko was writing in his bedroom. I was just, pursuing local maxima, going, oh, there's food here. I'll do this some more. Oh, this variation didn't work. Well, I'll stop that.
You evolved, became a highly developed creature. You mentioned 9/11, which I know, like Snowden. Where is he? Because he is in a lot of places. He's talked about that as this pivotal moment in American history, but world history, where suddenly the surveillance state doubled down.
Right.
And we sort of began this descent into a more Orwellian situation, where digital communications, there's just blanket surveillance. It's pervasive. I want to talk about that moment, but I wanted to talk about the cypherpunk years before that, what it was sort of like the atmosphere, what people were, determined to do. This was pre sort of mass surveillance at the scale that we see now, and then see what happened at that moment and how things have changed. So let's first of all go back, can you kind of evoke to me an atmosphere of what cypherpunk days were like pre 9/11 and what the ethos in the community was like? What was everyone rallying around? You already talked about freedom and self-sovereignty, but was it a different flavor to what we have now?
It was a small world of the internet. So I discovered the cypherpunks through, again, looking at all the things I could find on the internet. Just like I found PGP because it was the new file in the download directory. I found the cypherpunks list. It might have been the Wired magazine article, or I might have just been looking at a list of all the known mailing lists.
Well, it's like, did you ever watch *Halt and Catch Fire*, where you have Lee Pace, who's literally writing down all the URLs that exist? It's like, oh, you have a URL? Give me that address. I will add it to my list of all the URLs. It's it's such a fascinating concept that that's possible.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember being really pleased with, I think it was called Website of the Day or something like that. There was a web page you could go to, and they give you a fresh URL every day. And, you know, lists of known URLs on websites, stuff like that. But at some point, I discovered the Cypherpunks mailing list and subscribed and started reading the mails that would come in. And it was there was a smaller universe of the total number of people on the internet in those days. 1993, it was probably numbered in the tens of thousands, I think, total. You know, there was only tens or 100 people on that mailing list, probably. It was kind of like science fiction. It was very forward-looking. Like, as people on the Cypherpunks mailing list were telling each other, wow, this internet thing is going to be big. Like, there's going to be millions. Hundreds of millions. There could be 1 billion or more people on the internet someday, right?
A lot more prescient than Paul Krugman. It will have no more lasting effect on the economy than the fax machine.
Yeah, they were right about a lot of stuff. So they were right about the internet's going to be big. They were right about encryption is going to be the only real line of defense for people's personal privacy in that world, in the world of the internet. They were right about search engines. They said, wait till people convince search engines, and then everything will be different in the way we interact with information. You asked something about their politics. The Cypherpunks mailing list had heterogeneous political opinions on it, which I appreciate a lot more in retrospect, because I can't find any heterogeneous political opinions who keep ongoing conversations with each other.
Cohesion in any form, they just self-combust.
Yeah. So there were probably a majority or a plurality, like a third or a half of the people who frequently posted the Cypherpunks mailing list were libertarians, but there was a substantial contingent of other political persuasions as well. But they all enjoyed both arguing with each other about politics, but also inventing and teaching each other about technology and the ways it can interact with future politics. Did you know that, as far as I know, the full archives are lost?
Oh.
Lost of the Cypherpunk mailing list?
Interesting fact is that, you know, I've long since lost my copies of all the emails I got from the Cypherpunks mailing list, and as far as I could figure, I went around and asked, does anybody have a copy of your Cypherpunks? And there's some partial archives that show some of the letters that were posted, but much of it, no one has ever been able to tell me if there's a copy of it. So it's become mere oral history, which is kind of weird since it's like 1990s. It's Brewster Colley, the maker of the Internet Archive, likes to point out that there's this huge gap in our historical knowledge. Like, there's some ancient gaps, like when the Library of Alexandria was burned, we lost a lot. We don't know a lot of what happened then, but we know a lot of everything that was ever said or recorded or published, you know, up until about 20, 25 years ago. And then there's another gap. Right? We don't know what people were saying to each other, even what was on TV or whatever, you know, 20 years ago, as much as we know 40 years ago.
Wow.
Isn't that creepy?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's like a pivotal moment too. I mean, that's like when all the early encryption wars were going on, and where people were galvanized to start fighting for digital privacy. And like, what was your experience of the Cypherpunk years and those years? And were you on the mailing list as well?
I was on the mailing list. I was for no particular good reason, except just as a matter of form. I knew how to use a variety of anonymous remailers. Do you remember like anon.pennant.fi?
Yeah. Anonymous remailer. So you could send your email to this thing, and it would forward your email to the destination while hiding your original sending address.
Right. And I knew these things not because I had anything to hide, but just out of a sort of almost aesthetic sense that these principles mattered. And of course, this predates by decades like modern surveillance. But but certainly postdates the monstrousness of even what tin pot dictators like Ceausescu were doing in airbrushing people out of photos, right? So I guess we were living in a world in which 1984 could be written. So these notions of totalitarianism and these notions that a geographically distributed community was fundamentally transnational, and therefore the social norms needed to be almost deeply rooted in humanism, because what else do we have in common? Was weirdly universal. Like actually, now that I'm thinking about this as a person in my 40s, and I'm thinking about being a teenager in the 90s and having these sophisticated ideas about human liberty with a bunch of other people also concerned with it as a matter of principle. It's actually really remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Did you post to the list?
Did I? I'm trying to think. As we've been thinking about this, I was trying to think of what were my home lists where I was like a major contributor versus where I was just lurking. Was I ever a talker on early cyberpunks? I might not have. No, I don't. No. My obsessions and more like my social scene was, bug track.
What's bug track?
Bug track was a list for hackers.
Obviously you knew about it as well.
Bug track means
with a Q.
Learning about and analyzing bugs, which are vulnerabilities, which are opportunities for people to hack things or to fix them to become unhackable. Did I get that right? I never really read it.
Totally, yeah. The early moderation days, the handle of the moderator was Aleph1, who was some person who accreted this community, sharing and then analyzing what seemed like very exciting flaws in software that created those gaps for creativity. So I was much more there, though I was also, I had that foot in the community that, for instance, had me highly fluent with PGP, highly fluent with anonymous remailers, and early experiments in passing encrypted envelopes as a way of achieving a higher level of security on top of the IP network. So do you remember zero knowledge systems?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I was also an early adopter there. I guess that must have been late 90s.
Yeah, late 90s. I interviewed with them. Didn't get a job with them. Didn't take the job. I remember how that panned out. Yeah, I think the hacker and cypherpunk and cryptography communities were all really common assumptions, politically. Not, like I say, there was lots of divergent political opinions about politics, but there was this common assumption about, at that time, let me stop myself and try again. At that time, the authorities were not present. This was a new land. Mm-hmm. We had moved there and met each other and started making friends and building things together, and the authorities never set foot in that land, right? The police didn't do email, they didn't do BBSs, and so there's this shared culture almost, rather than shared politics. Of just do it yourself and take care of yourself and each other, and it was really pleasant.
Yeah,
it sounds pleasant.
Yeah, yes. So a shared sense that these things were really important.
Yeah.
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 Well, I know that Snowden, again, talks a lot about this in his book, about this world you're evoking where you have these pseudonymous lives, and it was
Right.
Keith Alexander deciding that he wants to store every single thing that's ever happened on the internet in perpetuity in a database associated to your real world identity, the current system we have. So he talks about this ephemeral world where people were free to explore ideas. They weren't wedded to those ideas because they knew that those ideas weren't going to come back and haunt them like 40 years later, because they were, everything on the internet is forever. It was pre all of that where things were actually ephemeral and not collected forever. This lost era of data you talked about.
Yeah.
And he just said how freeing that was, because it allowed people to explore ideas in a way that was non-confrontational and allowed them flexibility, because again, they're using pseudonyms. You talked about the person who ran this mailing list. You have no idea who they are.
Right.
These people could be someone else. They could cultivate another identity. It was escapism, and they could explore this new world. And then
People need that in order to be able to change.
yeah, so like how have things
Redefine
changed
themselves.
now? Because it feels like that is not the internet these days. The internet is something where you have to walk on eggshells lest you say something that could come back and haunt you 20 years later. It's a place where everything you say could be monitored by someone and collected, and most likely is being collected. I mean, how has that changed the culture, not just of the internet, but how's that changed real world culture of the physical space rather than the digital space? Have you seen that transfer over into like a chilling effect of how we live our day-to-day lives at all?
I wonder about that for young people, because they're the ones who need to reinvent themselves and
That's right.
try multiple things and leave things behind.
Yeah.
So I worry about that for them.
I'm so glad that my growing up predated digital photographs. I remember I backpacked around Europe for a long time, and it was early days of digital cameras. I didn't like the quality of it, so I insisted on taking film, and have the film cameras. And I was sad because I lost some of the film along the way, but I was also happy because they're private memories now, and they're not, these digital memories that are stored somewhere in a cloud that's unencrypted. Like, it's a different world, it's... But what's your experience been? So was the pivotal moment, do you agree that the pivotal moment was 9/11, and that was when the security state clamped down and said, okay, mass surveillance, we're just going to capture everything?
I'll throw out what might be a weird view. I think that we are still suffering from an error that was made not literally on the day of September 11th, but shortly thereafter, when what happened that day was widely characterized as specifically an intelligence failure. Let's take that notion seriously for a moment. A relatively small number of human beings, let's round up to a couple dozen, successfully shared a secret plan to kill a bunch of people. But we're really talking a couple dozen people. If you describe that as an intelligence failure, what you are asking for is an intelligence apparatus that is so vast that 24 people can't successfully keep a secret, which is a crazy thing to ask for. Right after a sort of emergent common wisdom that 9/11 was an intelligence failure, we started getting what we collectively asked for, which is an intelligence apparatus designed to make it literally impossible for 24 people to successfully keep a secret. And I think that has a whole bunch of disturbing implications that we're now dealing with.
I don't disagree at all, but I want to point out that there's a narrative which is false, which is that 9/11 was like the wake-up call, and the people and the leaders and the military and whoever decided to do things differently so that never again. Whereas, in fact, the cypherpunks were fighting this battle for almost 10 years before that. And there have been plenty of revelations about illegal, like blanket spying on innocent people without suspicion before that. In fact, there was a story told, I believe I heard this on the Cypherpunks mailing list before 9/11, which was the sort of espionage industrial complex, or whoever they are, they have the bill with all of their wish list on it, waiting in a desk drawer for the
Patriot Act is where they...
for the crisis, for the opportunity. So, and there's plenty of specific evidence of the NSA and others, and maybe we should look abroad from America and say that the same kinds of abuses were even more free from legal constraints. They may just have been less effective because their technology was not as developed in the 1990s, right? But my point is, the overall historical trend doesn't, to my mind, doesn't really change at 9/11. It shifted things definitely a lot in the ways you said in America, but it was already heading in that direction, and that was already the battle that the cypherpunks were envisioning and preparing for and fighting for 10 years before that. I don't want to minimize 9/11, not only the horror and loss of life, but also the impact it had on so many people, such as Ed Snowden's story, in which he basically, the way I read it, 9/11 radicalized him. And it took learning more and experiencing more to kind of deprogram himself from that. But on the other hand, if you look at the sort of historical forces at play, powerful organizations always want to increase their power. Maybe want is the wrong word. Maybe they don't even want it, but they're forced to increase their power. That's just the way that kind of organism changes over time. And which you see over and over in all history of humans. And today, some of the most pervasive and maybe even the most harmful violation of individual choice and individual privacy is performed by for-profit corporations, because for-profit corporations always want to improve their profits. It's the same pattern. So even if 9/11 had never happened, what the cypherpunks were predicting and fighting against in the 1990s would probably still have come to pass.
No, I love what you were saying about this already being in the works, because I completely agree. I mean, there are so many things right now where you see them using a big crisis as a vehicle for pushing through things that they've been wanting to push through for a long time. But who was it who said, never let a good crisis go to waste? And so you just see this leveraging of these terrible events and using this fear mechanism to push things through that society otherwise might have fought against. These things are generally so large that they want to implement these changes that society might push back generally against that and say, oh, that's too much. But if you're in the midst of a crisis and it's just an emergency measure, it's a lot easier to justify. The problem is that these so-called emergency measures, the emergency never ends, and you end up with it just being renewed and renewed, and these things never disappear.
Wish I could disagree, but I can't.
But you can't. So now I'll take a moment to cry and lament the state of things. So, I mean, if nothing else, 9/11 was a catalyst for pushing through change. I mean, right now I'm seeing a trend where already there's pervasive surveillance, but then you saw companies like Apple and Google, and they actually implemented all these encryption techniques for masses of people. We talk about big companies as being terrible for privacy, but they've also been
in part due to Snowden's revelations.
Exactly. Yeah, so this idea that some of their servers were being, accessed by the government unbeknownst to them.
To exploit their users without their knowledge.
No, it was a big thing, and so in turn, that led to a huge amount of the data on the encryption, like traffic actually becoming encrypted by default. iPhones started encrypting their devices by default. They realized, okay, we've got to protect things. It was a catalyst.
Which was the coming to pass of what the cypherpunks had said in the 1990s, that policy and norms and so on would not suffice. As the internet matured, then it would boil down to hard encryption or vulnerability. Those are the only two ways it would work.
Yeah, and well, on that note, the encryption that you were talking about with your mum, you're encrypting emails. You're like, hey, download this clunky thing, and it's kind of convoluted. You have to know command line code. Like, that's never going to be a recipe for mass adoption of protecting privacy.
Right.
So instead, we rely on these companies to say, okay, Apple, we'll encrypt all devices by default. We'll, make a big public push. And so that catalyzed things in that regard. But meanwhile, the government was catalyzed at the same time by pushing these new bills through and these new powers through. It really sped up the process of mass surveillance. So even though it seems like, yes, now we've got some tools for privacy and encryption, the government's right there alongside. So where are we now? Like, where are we in this battle? Because I'm seeing a lot of bills that the government's putting through. The next advancement of this fight seems to be bringing back the fight against encryption. So many bills that want to make it illegal to encrypt devices. We've got the Earn It bill. You've got the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data Act. You've got, the different there's so many different powers right now. And in the UK, they're talking about this. They just launched this giant campaign. They've hired this advertising agency, Saks or something, to turn public opinion against encryption. Say this is about protecting children, and it's insidious the way they're doing it. They've got these pop-up, performance art. Pieces. They've got, the first step one of the campaign is to make it seem like a grassroots movement of a bunch of children's charities coming together organically to protest. Like, it's crazy, and governments are mobilizing in this way now. They're fighting on all fronts. So where are we now in this fight? Do we still have the fervent believers of when you guys, were young cypherpunks saying we've got to fight for privacy? Are those people still galvanized? Have we got new people galvanized? Is it a lost cause at this point in time? Where do we stand?
Well, I think it's certainly not a lost cause. I think one of the things that we're describing is how difficult it is to turn off power. Even in a chaotic democracy, I happen to really like living in a chaotic democracy because I strongly suspect that it's anti-fragile. I think healthy societies are ones where lots of people are pursuing lots of different strategies, and some of them are at odds with each other because predicting the future is really hard. So even in the face of astronomically rare events, like some people somewhere have got that covered. Like they've been waiting for that to happen, and they've got the strategy. So the net effect is extraordinary resilience, and in fact sometimes even anti-fragility. The anti-pattern here is that when there's a change of power in a democratically elected government, it's rare that any previous power grabs are actually dismantled. Instead, the new team takes over and is like, finally, the adults are in charge. So this dangerous thing is safe now because we're the ones in charge of it. And so these power grabs are never given up.
So it reminds me of my favorite quip, one of my favorite quips. The problem with being a libertarian is that every 4 years, half of your team defects to the other side.
Well said.
Right, but so of course it's easy to bemoan government power grabs, but here's a counterpoint that I think is both obvious and not obvious. I think we all see that it's easier to destroy than create. It's literally easier. It's also usually faster to destroy than create. So if you've ever worked on a Lego model with your kid when your kid is, let's say, 4, you have experienced the hours that go into building undone by just mere minutes of tantrum. But I think, therefore, there must be a necessary corollary, which is the vast preponderance of human beings are good. Because if that was not the case, we'd all be dead. Because it's just so much easier to destroy than create, that the reason why there's so many of us is that it turns out that the really highly committed to destruction people are a relatively small in number. And the destruction that's happening all the time, on balance, is counteracted by the constructive cooperation of everybody else. So, but this means, of course, that the consequentially government power grabs and invasions of privacy are bad, while the government is mostly composed of good people who do not want to be lumped in with Ceausescu, right? So, I think that it doesn't it doesn't have to always be bad. Like there are ways of swinging the pendulum back. But the linear solutions to that usually fall to coordination problem. So no one is really in charge of the United States government, and I think much of politics is people struggling with that realization after they get the job of supposedly being in charge. Can you imagine? Now everyone thinks you run this thing, and you're like, oh my God.
I had nothing to do with this.
Right. So I'm actually really bullish on hackers, on cyberpunks, on this distributed population of people who are opting in to the creation of tools of empowerment. I think that we've just begun a new era of tool making in this regard, and like one of us can't defeat this anti-pattern towards totalitarian power grabs, but all of us absolutely can. So do we solve this by mastering the coordination function and suddenly getting governments to take some organized response to responsibly dismantling their own power apparati? I can't even imagine how that's possible.
So it seems like agorism is the solution that you propose, like people finding ways outside of the system, not bothering with the political route, because it seems like, as you said, they're not going to dismantle their own power.
I don't know. I'm a fan of the Bill of Rights. We could bring the Bill of Rights back. I heard recently on Econ Talk by Russ Roberts. Am I allowed to shill other podcasts?
Absolutely, yeah.
So Russ Roberts is a great thinker.
That's a good one to
his show is called Econ Talk, but it really should be called Philosopho Talk because he doesn't really do economics that often anymore. But he recently ruefully quipped something like, only the First and Second Amendments are still in effect. And I was like, really? Oh my God. I'm like,
right.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Like I could easily imagine, and you might feel differently, but I could easily imagine the U.S. Supreme Court bringing the Fourth Amendment back. And crypto might be...
But I would say that it's even worse than that, and that maybe only, maybe none of them, because First Amendment, we've got Assange who's been detained for the last decade for speaking truth to power, and they may phrase it as, oh, we actually detained him for this other reason, but they literally have locked up a journalist for posting facts about the US government that embarrassed them. So, and now they're, charging this journalist who's a foreign national, is not an American citizen. Yeah. He wasn't in America. They're charging him under the US Espionage Act.
I am concerned about the erosion of the First Amendment in that instance and in many instances. So yeah, it could go worse in that direction. But I just wanted to interrupt because you were saying agorism is the solution. I wanted to point out, well, there's a plethora. There's what were you saying earlier about the heterogeneity of society and lots of different solutions and lots of different people doing different things? Well, I also value the I don't know if it's conservatives or what you would call them, but the ones who want to bring the Constitution back.
Bring it.
That could also
Make
help.
the Constitution cool again.
Well, in I guess the conception that I'm bringing to bear is that the tools that we're creating create the space for, what they do is they create frontier space. And one of the values of frontier space is room to experiment and reconceive cultural norms, modes of treating each other. And I think that those cultural norms are ontologically prior to government norms. So, or to apply a startup principle to politics and society, culture eats strategy for breakfast. When you were talking earlier, Naomi, about being happy that the online photo sharing culture didn't exist when you were younger, it reminded me of an emergent social norm of all of the hacker parties that I attended when I was a teenager, all of which predated camera-enabled smartphones, but didn't predate digital photography. So people were going around with cameras, and the universal social norm was after someone took a photo, they showed it to the people who were in it and said, do you want me to delete this or not? Because we culturally valued that and had some sense that there was probably no delete button on the internet. So so the time to delete was right there. That's right.
The modern norm is like, oh, can I have a look at that? It's like, no, already live tweeted it. Like, oh,
Right.
God, why would you do that?
No, that's not the norms in my circles. I
Right.
see people interacting more like that, where people are thoughtful about one another's privacy preferences nowadays.
So what do you think of this? What do you think of this theory? I think that the what I'm describing is very fast cultural norm evolution. Like, can you imagine that was a universal practice, like in this social scene in the 90s? I think what happened is that the early internet embraced a principle of openness and accessibility, and therefore cool stuff happened, and assholes showed up, and no one was thinking we're going to technically block the assholes from showing up, so we need to evolve social norms that maintain openness and somehow preserve cool, collaborative, pseudonymous interactions, and like don't let the rare assholes kind of ruin it for everybody. Like, so you can solve that with technology, or you can solve that with cultural norms. And if your technology embraces openness, I guess you have to solve this with social norms. And I think that we could generate a giant list of the ways in which sort of cool, open 90s internet culture has died, but I think a common thread is that the tool creation that we're doing creates the space for rethinking those cultural norms, trying some new experiment, and then totally crazy things happen. Like the social norms of us nerds are now how people in giant corporations get work done. Like Slack is just IRC. This is amazing.
Yeah, I think it's easier for people to overfit. How many years has it been since 9/11? 12, 13, something like that?
2001, like 21 years.
I've lost track of time. Edit that out. So that's a good fit actually for how many years the current sort of pendulum swing of technology, right? The ascendance of surveillance capitalism,
Right.
the spread of everything that we now currently rely on every day. It all started 20 years ago, really.
Yeah, right.
I think, like the software and everything.
Right.
And it's easy to assume, oh, well, this 20-year span is sort of the trend of history. But you could also say, well, this was a 20-year pendulum swing. The technology happened to be such that the biggest player successfully hacked everyone else first instead of the technology. So in general, offense has been easier than defense in InfoSec for the last 40 years or whatever. And most experts, and you, Michael knows more than I about this kind of stuff, so feel free to disagree with me, but most experts say that that's because of some natural law. It's like entropy or something, like offense is just easier than defense in InfoSec. That's the way it works. I disagree. I think it's a historical 40-year accident, and that 40 years from now, people's software tools are going to defend them against any software attacker. And it could also be the same with culture and with politics. I don't know what the future is going to be like. I think the younger generation that I interact with is much more sensible and intentional about how they take care of themselves and each other than old farts credit them for.
I want to dive into what you were saying about surveillance capitalism, because I have a theory about how we got here. And it has to do with monetization and cryptocurrency.
Because the fundamental flaw of the internet is we never implemented HTTP 302 payment required. No, 203. I've forgotten. I've also forgotten how many years it's been.
Micropayments were impossible in the early years because it just wasn't financially feasible. It was too cumbersome. Existing financial rails didn't allow it, and it just wasn't cheap enough. There were so many reasons why that.
I tried at the time. I went to work for DigiCash and tried to implement that HTTP code and failed.
Yeah, I mean, I want
Well, it
to dive
wasn't
into
my
DigiCash.
failure. It was because DigiCash didn't have decentralized technology. It's a good example of how someone might overfit and say, "Oh, private payment systems or private monies can never work." And they did say that. Right. After DigiCash failed, everyone was always telling me, "Oh, that's a good thing we've all learned that can never work," right? Until Bitcoin showed that a different thing can work in a different way. And those people are basically still saying that, but they're shutting up more and more year after year. Like there's a half-life of how many of them are still willing to say, "That's a scam, it's never going to work."
And it'll end up with just Peter Schiff on his box saying, "I swear, it's going to burst any second." Now we do have cryptocurrency. It's decentralized. It's really exciting that we have these payment models. Are we going to see a swing away from this advertising model of the internet where it's literally in their best interest and most profitable to capture people's data because that's how they monetize, when today it's super easy to just send a micropayment to someone to send them appreciation or contribute to the work? Like, it's fundamentally different paradigm in terms of monetization. Is that all that's needed to catalyze a shift away from this data collection model?
Well, I don't know for sure how it'll pan out, but Apple sells products to users. Google sells user data to advertisers, right? And someone said to me recently, it's hard for a company to outrun their incentives.
Moreover, you'd be surprised how often there's a disconnect between a company's stated values and mission and its revenue model. And when you play that out over many iterations, the revenue model is always the enduring mission. So of those two, the one that expires sooner is the stated mission when there's a disconnect from the revenue model. But I think that's just, that's not a law of the universe. That's just a common design flaw of organizations. And it certainly doesn't have to be that way. There are many companies that have better designed revenue models than others. I think when we talk about the monetization of data by advertising, we're paying attention to the wrong thing. What's been happening over the past 20 years is that the amount of data generated by our lives has been dramatically increasing. We all know this, which means it's not really scarce. The scarce thing is your attention. Even in a far-flung future where we have Star Trek-style replicators and physical want is gone, everyone has all the stuff they could possibly desire, I bet you there's still going to be an economy because there will still be a limited amount of attention available. So attention is an extraordinarily scarce thing in this universe and in many possible universes. And what the scalability of ad revenue as a revenue model gets us is a funneling of a huge amount of human ingenuity into capturing attention and not letting it go. Because every moment that you're holding attention is another moment you get to monetize via ads. And the real tragedy, the real perversity there is that computers, described by Steve Jobs ages ago as a kind of bicycle for the mind, a tool to expand your capabilities, is increasingly suborned into distracting you from getting something done, as opposed to empowering you.
Which is
to get
diminishing
something
your
done.
capabilities. It's
Exactly
making you
right.
dumber
That's
and
right.
worse at everything
That's
you want
right.
to do.
I was so excited about the possibilities of a computer when I first interrupted the boot process of an Apple II computer in my elementary classroom and got a basic prompt.
And then you discovered TikTok and you've never done work ever since. You discovered those cat videos that your colleagues knew
That's
would
exactly right.
lead to
Like,
world domination.
The kids who are my age now, as I was then, are instead navigating these distraction engines. I'm not going to predict doom and gloom. I just think that's disappointing.
I agree, and it's also, I think, you're correct that it's the outcome of the available economic models in the early days of the internet. There's some good documentation of this, of the people who were there. I was around at the time in the 90s doing different stuff, but explicitly saying, we searched and searched. We tried this, we tried that.
Right.
That didn't work.
Right.
Then we hit on advertising, and that saved our company.
Right.
And that's why the whole rest of the internet for the next 25 years was based on that.
Right.
But also to my thing about history doesn't just only move in one direction. Like, just because it's the only thing that's scaled up for the past 25 years doesn't mean that it won't be different 5 or 10 years from now.
I think it must be different. Like, honestly, this problem doesn't bother me too much because it solves itself. Because advertising is only valuable if some people are doing real value creation.
Somebody somewhere.
Right? Like advertising in as a pure social good is an amazing gatekeeperless way for the inventor of a life improvement to communicate to the people whose lives could be improved by that invention. So that's awesome. Let's keep that. But it can't be the whole economy because someone has to pay for that advertising, and that person is someone who's created something valuable.
But you end up with diminishing tools for how those builders can get their stuff done if they can't find workers to help participate because no one has the skill set anymore because they're watching TikTok instead of tinkering with, original Apple computers and figuring out how they work. Like, you lose a whole section of the population who would otherwise be mobilized and have that skill to be able to participate. And instead,
Right.
they're just these kind of vessels for, I don't know, I think it does make people dumber. I think that it's a little scary.
Right. I think it's a momentary super optimization. Consider a future far, far from now when somebody wants to make clothing out of petrochemicals. What the people in the year 3000 should do is obviously, unfreeze someone alive in this decade, right? Like, we've oriented a huge amount of the entire globe into very, very efficiently converting oil into like polyester, nylon, and then forming it into clothing sold as workout gear. Like, this is amazing. And it's it's a crazy over-optimization. Like, no one should probably be wearing clothing made of plastic. But we got really good at it, like crazy good in like the past 30 years. I think humans just go through these like just crazy deep dive super optimizations, and we're like, what was that all about?
I guess one reason I think that history doesn't move in one direction is because there's a natural evolutionary response, right? If advertisers are successfully preying on you and earning slivers of a penny by distracting you from whatever you were about to do that might have been a great improvement for other people in your life, well, eventually I think people adapt to that. I kind of suspect that the sort of the opposite, I'm a contrarian. I like to investigate what if the opposite of what everyone else says is true. So old grumpy boomers say, like, kids these days, they don't care about privacy and they're just watching TikTok all the time and they're distracted. And I think to myself, what if kids these days really care about privacy in a way that you don't understand, but a better way, a more effective way, because they've had to grow up with it and it matters to them? And what if they're a lot better at managing their attention and learning from TikTok or whatever, which is the opposite of how you see things because you're a grumpy old man.
Are you calling me a grumpy old man right now?
I was talking to myself. This is me arguing with me.
Because I think that I probably am a grumpy old man. I'll take it. I'll own that as well.
I'm really optimistic about Gen Z. I must say, I think that the internet has made the weirdness of people one click away for an entire generation, and what I'm seeing is a kind of practicality about this that I associate with like the silent generation. So like, get over your taboos, whatever. Okay, so you have some kink, like, fine. Like, that's not what we're going to organize society around.
Yeah.
This get on with it sort of attitude that I think is
the
really
cell
cool.
phones and the social media, it really has empowered this generation to be the undisputed, unquestioned arbiter of their own actions, right? Before there was cell phones, you had to negotiate like access to the car or how the other people in your town behave or whatever. And now I think the kids these days are absorbing this into their culture, that what they do and with whom on their phones, it does not have to be subject to anyone else's input,
right?
Oversight, unless they choose, which they do.
So
right?
is that spawning a new generation of people who may be somewhat anti-authoritarian? Like, you actually have no right to intercede and
I think so, because it's not ideological. It's you naturally find whatever you grew up with, you find to be really normal, right?
Right, exactly. And so these kids are growing up with a vastly wider aperture of normality and an earlier rejection of gatekeeping. So in exactly the conditions that Zooko is describing, the gatekeepers are adults and are therefore associated with maturity. So growing up to become a gatekeeper feels kind of like it's isomorphic with maturing. Now I'm seeing kids recognizing self-appointed gatekeepers to a particular micro niche or community as just a variety of being an asshole that you just shouldn't do. So that rejection of would-be gatekeeping as just pointless ways of dividing people into different others, that's eroding, I think, in a way that might open the door to wholly new forms of collaboration and acceptance.
I wanted to circle back, just go back to cryptocurrency and how that might be changing things, and talk about it from the surveillance state apparatus that we looked at, because I know a lot of people got into cryptocurrency because they saw this as a vehicle for reclaiming decision over their own financial opportunities and all of this. And at the same time, governments have seen the transfer of money as being a control mechanism. You know, you just shut down donations to WikiLeaks and suddenly you can silence them because they can't fund themselves. They're not sustainable. You know, they can't operate. They have to pay for servers. Suddenly crypto comes along and it's like, actually, you can no longer shut down payments to WikiLeaks. There are alternative methods. So this apparatus for control has kind of been turned over and is no longer that effective the more popular cryptocurrency becomes. So do you see this as a force for fundamentally changing society? Not just like, I mean, I see a lot of people on Robinhood who are buying and selling crypto, and obviously there are people buying NFTs. There's all this superficial activity people are piling in. But do you see a more fundamental, like seismic shift? Like, do you see a more fundamental change happening as a result of cryptocurrency in society?
Well, yeah, I do agree with you that control of the use of money is the government uses, the United States government and most governments use that as a form of social control. And it feels like it's gotten sort of tighter and tighter over the decades. Maybe that's because the way we use money has changed, or maybe that's because the way the government behaves has evolved. I'm not sure.
But I was chatting to Bruce Fenton, who's in the crypto world, and he's telling me about how, like 20 years ago, you didn't need to show an ID to open a bank account. Like, there were so many things that we take as normal now. Like, of course the government's gonna, be able to monitor my payments. But like 20 years ago, that was not normal. That would have been like shocking.
Well, 30 years ago.
30 years ago? We're both bad at judging time.
I was off by a decade, so what's a decade between friends? Yeah, so, and that's why Russ Roberts was right when he discounted the Fourth Amendment. The reason the Fourth Amendment is no longer in force in the United States is because of the third-party doctrine, combined with the fact that everything everyone does is done through third parties today.
Right.
And so that's why I was earlier saying optimistically, maybe the Fourth Amendment will make a comeback because cryptocurrencies can let you do those things without going through third parties and other related technologies. I do feel optimistic about it, and I wanted to point out that the people who just like buying and selling cryptos as though they are stocks on Robinhood are a really great part of it. Like, people who are not ideologically motivated and haven't learned or have different preferences or beliefs about politics are super important and pushing in the right direction. This diverse, heterogeneous society of people who have different plans and different preferences is part of what makes it grow in the right direction.
I'm going to throw out a challenge. I really don't know how to solve this problem, but I feel particularly well qualified to identify it, which is the relationship between security, freedom, and retributive justice. The fact is that we're secure right now in this room, in this building, not because the locks on this building are unpickable or even particularly secure. We're secure, and all this gear is secure from theft, primarily because retributive justice works in this community. Burglars get caught. In environments where that is not the case, the burden of security shifts to the person with assets. If you live in a kind of failed state, you need a great set of locks on your door, and you might need to project your own force to try to keep yourself secure. And we see this pattern again and again and again. It happens either in failed states or just in the absence of a state, like on the frontier. Even in America, the American West was classically populated with people who needed their own guns. We don't need to walk around armed as much because the civilizing force of retributive justice means mostly security works retroactively. Don't go being a predator because you'll get caught and taken out of the population. Everything works. Cryptocurrency is, but by nature of its its novelty, is literally harder to hold. Like you have more responsibility when you hold it. If I lose my credit card, it's not that big of a deal. Why? Essentially because it can get fixed on the back end. Like, oh, someone stole my credit card, we'll reverse those charges, you're fine, right? Someone steals my cryptocurrency, I'm in a world of hurt. So it has that frontier dynamic where in the absence that everything can be made right retroactively, you need to invest a lot more in securing it up front. And that's not something that's simply not normal.
Yeah, that's new.
Right?
I want to add on that in physical security, like protecting your bike from being stolen, the expense of big, thick gates and all that, or cameras or guns or whatever, is a loss to society.
Right.
Like it's good for the big, thick gate makers, but to everyone else, we're worse off.
100% correct, yes.
But in software, I actually think it's one of the most great things about the whole cryptocurrency event is because I think it might trigger this historical shift from software offense always defeating software defense. And in part, that's because of the fact that the defenders were relying on the police to punish the attackers.
Right.
For the last 40 years.
Right.
And in the crypto world, they don't, for various reasons. It's transnational,
Yes.
it's anonymous, the police aren't really going to do a good job of it, even if you ask them. And so therefore, there's a much faster, so it's bad because a lot of people are losing a lot of money, and that's bad and regrettable. But the consequence of it is it's a much faster evolutionary cycle where those things that were vulnerable and that put their users at risk, they fall down and get consumed by the forest floor and new things grow up in their place. That's happening so much faster in crypto in the last 4 years than in the last 40 years of the traditional software industry.
And another thing that we see playing out in cryptocurrency security that has simply not played out in, let's say, broader internet security is defense for everyone. In the broader world of internet security or corporate network security, you run again and again into a metaphor that's often expressed in terms of a bear. Our goal is not to outrun the bear, it's to outrun the other people trying to outrun the bear. And that's deeply cynical. And everyone who is modeling their own goal that way is not helping society. They're just trying to outrun the other victims. The total number of victims is not being reduced. All this technology that's helping you run faster is simply changing who the victims are, which is really disappointing as like a life goal, right? In the cryptocurrency space, we see much more collective benefit defensive thinking. How do we make this whole thing harder to attack, instead of how do I make my holdings harder to steal than your holdings?
Yeah, the crypto technologists, the cryptocurrency Web3 technologists are very much positive sum thinkers in that way. Now, the traders, much as I love them and I think they really contribute to the world by buying and selling on Robinhood and so forth, but they're totally zero-sum thinkers because anything they put into one coin, they're taking out of a different coin. So I don't like that part of dealing with them. But the cryptocurrency technologists are very positive sum and they're very optimistic. I really love it. They're mostly young. They've mostly not got as many battle scars as I have. And they've got these scars in their eyes like, oh yeah, we'll just invent this new thing. Everyone will use it and no one will ever get hacked again. And I love it because they're making really serious progress.
Another distinction that I would make, instead of just zero sum versus non-zero sum or zero sum versus positive sum, there's also a difference in modeling what game you're playing. Are we playing a finite game or are we playing an infinite game?
What does that mean?
So infinite games are games that don't have to halt. So in most trading games, this is certainly a finite game because I win by you losing, and that function halts. Eventually, I have everything, right? The infinite games are, maybe to use the modern vernacular, sustainable games, and therefore tend to be where all of the true for the worldwide population value creation games are. I certainly think that it's better to be alive today than 3,000 years ago. Why? Well, this Earth is a little heavier than it was 3,000 years ago because of the space dust that's fallen on it. But it's not the space dust that's the source of the wealth. It's literally better to be alive now versus then because of knowledge, new knowledge that has been acquired and tools that have been developed. It's the same stuff. So one way to model this world is it's absolutely finite game, and the way that I enrich myself is that I get a mountain of stuff that's now not yours, or I get to rule over this population because I defeated you in battle, so you don't get to rule, right? There's a lot of background noise. This beta is just taking stuff and taking people away from each other. And against that background, which distracts a lot of people even to this day, the real alpha are the relatively small number of people who've been playing a different game. And I propose that it's always about inventing new tools, discovering new knowledge that makes the same finite stuff literally more valuable or literally more shareable.
Might include culture in that knowledge.
Absolutely. It's either a form of knowledge or it's a form of tool. I would say that voting, for instance, is a kind of social technology to help human beings cooperate with each other. So a lot of what has made this world better than 3,000 years ago is the invention of that kind of social technology and its successful transmission across generations. And the rest of it is just moving the mountains of the stuff around. Right? So apparently that distracts a lot of people. They're like, ooh, I could win this finite game.
It's really concerning to me the more I realize that almost everyone believes axiomatically, without even thinking about it, without even realizing there's a decision or a belief or anything, it's just obvious to them that all of economics is zero sum.
Yeah.
And I just think to myself, that's such a deep mistake. Like, how much of everything else in your entire worldview needs to be revisited?
Yeah. Yeah, such a shame. That I think it might not be a coincidence that so far in a lifetime of being an entrepreneur and trying out new companies, the most financially successful one was also the one with, I think, the best designed interplay, as we were talking about, between revenue model and mission. We designed a company, a defensive security company, that exists to do a good thing for the world, and if we succeed at it, that makes us the money. Surprisingly, the narrative is reversed in a lot of the world, which is we do this thing for money, and then we use 1% to do something good, right?
Something I was told when I was a budding entrepreneur by my mentors that I looked up to was you could probably aim to capture about 10% of the value you're creating for the whole world.
Nice. Right, that's a good heuristic.
So
I like that a lot.
A good thing to aim for is to create $1 trillion worth of value. So maybe that's increase 1 billion people's lives by $1,000 worth of added benefit of some kind. and aim to get $100 billion of that back to your investors and yourself. And
Right. See, if you were conceiving of any enterprise as being a kind of club, an opt-in club for value creation, then I would say that those that are conceived in the way that you just described are sustainable. They're capable of being infinite games.
right.
And then when you start going down that rabbit hole, one of the funny things about the world is that the sustainable value creation games are the ones that generate value and then use some of that value to increase their own capacity to generate more value. And those naturally, almost by definition, have to be profitable. Then you have do-gooding organizations that are not sustainable, and we call them charities. And unfortunately, we associate charities, which is to say unsustainable value creation. You have to constantly feed them new resources in order for them to do good. We associate that with having a higher moral value than the sustainable do-gooding organizations. And I think the root of that mistake is missing the infinite game players from the finite game players that are fundamentally just shifting resources around and trying to hoard, and that's how they have their profits. And those exist. You can be extractive. You can extract and hoard. That's one way to make money, but that's not the same as the inventive, for instance, technology companies that seem to keep being capable of improving lives.
To overgeneralize, at the risk of overgeneralization, I would say more or less all of government and more or less all of financial industry are zero sum. They may be doing some good at the expense of doing some bad, but they're not the infinite game, positive value creation of the real economy.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But they somehow seem to loom large in the brand
and also
of enterprise,
and also in the facts. Those two sectors, government and financialization, have grown to occupy more and more of the overall economy over the past 50 years.
Right.
I'm just concerned that they're both growing so fast as a proportion of the entire economy. And they basically think of them as approximately zero sum, maybe negative sum, especially the government part.
I think one of the biggest factors that make them intertwined at the moment is all the easy credit. You just have a government that is printing money ad nauseum, and that's being funneled directly into the financial sector. When you have all these banks that basically have a direct line of credit to the Fed, and the Fed is just printing astronomical amounts of money, you end up with, I mean, the world is flush with cash right now. You look at all the VC money that's flying around. You look at the S&P that has like, well, maybe not this week, but generally is like a new all-time high every other week. You know, it's just money that's being transferred out of the pocketbooks, out of the savings accounts of everyone, and being fed directly into financial institutions. And so it's no surprise to me that they're both growing really, really fast right now. What happens when you expropriate savings from an entire population? So is crypto helpful in that? Is that what's going to kind of break the cycle, put a nut in the churning wheels there?
I don't like predicting the future, but I'm happy with providing people with alternatives that work and that some people like giving people options.
I think one of the hardest things to model in order to be capable of answering your question, we can take a step back and say, is your question answerable? And one of the things that we're collectively struggling with is that the norms of money management are like Chesterton's fence. So in some cases, we need to just get rid of that fence. But in many, many cases...
You should probably tell the story of Chesterton's fence.
Should I know Chesterton? Have I met Chesterton before?
Remember Chesterton?
You interviewed him last week.
This is a Wikipedia-able reference to, I think, I'm going to blow all the specifics, I think a British statesman who was really speaking metaphorically about resisting the reductive arrogance of would-be revolutionaries who show up and see a fence in the middle of nowhere. Like, what is the point of this fence? Obviously, we should get rid of the fence. And Chesterton's rejoinder is, if you don't see the point of the fence, that's actually a reason to leave it there. Someone thought there needed to be a fence there, so we really must figure out why that happened before we boldly declare that we don't need fences here. So it's just an argument for kind of intellectual humility as a world improver.
So is this a defense of the financialized economy?
Right. Essentially, what I'm saying is the norms that we have are, by definition, the survivable and intergenerationally transmissible norms. So we should assume a survivorship bias. Like, there have been many ideas about how to do financial management, many ideas about how to manage an economy, and a lot of them have died for interesting reasons. What we have is essentially the surviving ideas, and it's hard to see them in the same way it's hard as a fish to see the water. So we don't know what the wise parts are that we need to learn from and possibly transfer to the frontier, and what are the vestigial tales that we're better off dumping. And I think no one can know that. So we almost need to run through the same iterative process, like like little autonomous agents modeled by teenage Zooko. And that's a big body of work. So the open question is, can we even do t-shirt sizing? Is it a small body of work? Is it a medium body? Is it an extra large body of work? And how fast can we get it done?
For what it's worth, I really do strongly agree with that as well, even though it contradicts what I said a minute ago. No, I really do agree. That's what I call conservative political philosophy. And I think it's totally right. It's that nobody knows how to make a pencil. Nobody knows how a car works. Nobody knows. The economy is not even like a car. The economy is like, in Russ Roberts' beloved metaphor, a prairie. It's got a bunch of species and environment and things happening, and you're not going to go create one, no matter how much you study this one. Mm-hmm. You've got to preserve it.
That's right. Nobody knows what everybody knows. I think that most people are in workplaces where the organization that pays them doesn't know what it knows. We all experience this problem, even while we're potentially voting for governments to try to rule every aspect of our lives. Like if your own tiny organization can't even figure out what it's good at and what it should do and what it should not do, maybe don't try to scale up the linear management practices to the level of entire societies. It's probably not going to do as well as ground up processes.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's time for us to go to dinner.
All right.
So
Dinner!
on that note, we're going to take this conversation offline. We're going to go have some dinner, but this has been...
Let's go eat some animal-sourced food products.
Oh my gosh,
Yes.
I'm cutting that out of the video. So this is not going out to my broader audience. All right, we're going to wrap this up, but it's so wonderful chatting with both of you. We will continue this conversation. It's going to be like a monthly podcast that we do now. Zooko and Michael
There we
in
go.
the room.
That's right.
Once a month, just chatting about things
There we go.
and cypherpunk things. But I'm grateful for your optimism from both of you. I too am excited about the future, but being around your, such excitable outlook about the future, I'm even more excited. So thank you for chatting with me.
Oh, nice. All right.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Naomi.
giving us a channel to possibly transmit some optimism into the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
This is fun.
Let's go eat food.
All right.